I'm Lena Carter, and I'm 29 years old. If you asked me what first pulled me into customer behavior analytics, I'd probably say it was simple curiosity about people. Ever since I was a kid, I wanted to know why someone chose one thing over another, why a single sentence could shift the way someone acted. Maybe that curiosity is what led me to Northbridge Dynamics, a data analytics company based in Denver, known for its predictive models built on oceans of numbers, algorithms, and charts. I started working there 3 years ago, hoping to find a place driven by data but still grounded in humanity. But only a few months in, I realized Northbridge wasn't what I imagined. Internal competition ran deep. Employees watched each other like rivals, and meetings often felt like arenas where everyone tried to prove themselves right by tearing someone else down. In that atmosphere, someone like me, someone who believed data meant more when paired with emotion, felt completely out of place. My department head was Martha Kincaid, a woman in her early 50s with a harsh temperament and a talent for making people feel like every conversation was an interrogation. Martha believed data never lied, that everything should be ruled by procedure. She rarely smiled, and empathy wasn't something she offered freely. New hires usually took a few weeks to understand that Martha wasn't the kind of leader you approach with sincerity or fresh ideas. She only cared about whatever protected her position. It took me a long time to understand why Martha was always so defensive. Years ago, she'd been considered a strong candidate for Chief Strategy Officer. Then, a 27-year-old outshone her with a breakthrough project and claimed that promotion right out from under her. Martha lost her chance, and from then on, she carried the fear of being outpaced. The story circulated through the company like an unofficial legend, whispered more than spoken. I didn't think much of it until my own project started to take shape. Horizon had been growing quietly inside me for over a year. I wanted to build a behavioral prediction model that didn't rely solely on raw data, but also captured the harder to measure pieces: personal motivation, cultural background, family values, and lived experiences across different American communities in a rapidly shifting tech landscape. I believe data told only half the story. The other half lived in what people said and everything they didn't. I spent months visiting small businesses across suburban Denver: cafe owners, software vendors, online retailers, and startup founders. Each person gave me a new fragment. I recorded conversations, took notes, and reviewed their transaction histories, comparing their words to their numbers. Slowly, a complicated, breathing model formed. Horizon became something I was both proud of and terrified of. Terrified because I knew, once launch day approached, Martha would do everything she could to block it. Martha despised the way I collected data. She couldn't understand why I had to meet customers myself instead of sitting behind a screen with spreadsheets. She called it a waste of time, something that didn't fit Northbridge's precious analysis protocols. Every time she passed my desk, she paused, watching, judging, hoping to catch me doing something wrong. I noted every glance, every question edged with suspicion. She knew my project was gaining attention from upper leadership, and it scared her. While the silent tension between us grew, someone else began appearing more often: Elliot Morgan, Northbridge's youngest shareholder. He rarely involved himself in day to day operations, yet lately he'd been checking in with department heads about new projects. Elliot had a calm manner, sharp eyes, and a way of speaking that made you feel he understood more than he let on. One afternoon, he invited me to grab coffee downstairs. He asked about Horizon, not with scrutiny, but with genuine interest. I stayed cautious. Shareholders sometimes cared more about profit curves than real value. When I walked out of that cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling that Elliot knew far more about the tension between Martha and me than he admitted. But he didn't say a word. That only made things more mysterious and more volatile. For the first time, I sensed that whatever was happening between Martha and me wasn't just personal conflict. It was part of a larger tug of war inside the company, a quiet battle over mindset, power, and the future of Northbridge Dynamics. I started the Horizon Project by doing exactly the things Martha loved to call a waste of time. I spent more days outside the office than in it, going to places she insisted I had no reason to show up at. But I knew the numbers Northbridge collected only told part of the story. People make decisions based on emotions, personal needs, relationships, and 100 invisible forces that never appear on a spreadsheet. And if I wanted to build a prediction model that actually worked, I had to listen to them. I spent weeks in Aurora, in small shops run by Mexican American families. I sat in Mr. Roberto's corner store, listening to him explain that his customers didn't buy from him just because of low prices. They bought because the place felt familiar. I watched the way he greeted people, how he remembered every name, how he always set aside a few items he knew they liked. After that, I went to Boulder to talk to young tech startups fighting to survive a brutal market. Their founders loved to talk about data, but most of their decisions came straight from fear and hope, not numbers. I interviewed dozens of people across different towns. Each one gave me a new piece of horizon. I started to see that my model wasn't just a collection of data, it was a portrait of how Americans behave in a market that changes faster than they can keep up. I built charts, tested algorithms, modeled behavior groups, and tied them to the emotional patterns I'd observed. Horizon grew more alive than anything Northbridge's standardized models had ever produced. Every night when I got home, I opened my laptop and kept refining the model. Some nights I stayed up until 2 in the morning, eyes burning, but heart electric. Horizon had become more than a project. It was proof of what I believed. People are never as simple as the numbers pretending to define them. I wanted to show that, not for recognition, but because the market needed a more human approach. While I poured myself into Horizon, Martha watched me more closely than ever. She often passed my desk and asked a question that sounded harmless, but carried layers of suspicion. How many hours had I spent off-site? Why did I talk so long with customers? Why didn't my charts match the department's standard format? Her questions suffocated me, but they didn't stop me. One day, Martha demanded a draft of Horizon. I knew if I gave her an unfinished version, she would twist it into proof that my work was flawed, or worse, steal the direction I was heading. I sidestepped it by saying the model wasn't stable enough yet. Martha stared at me, cold and silent. She didn't have to say a word for me to know she wouldn't let that go. As the tension between us simmered, something unexpected happened. Some of the customers I'd visited reached out directly to Northbridge and mentioned my name in glowing feedback. They said my questions made them feel like more than a data source, that they trusted my analysis, that they wanted to see Horizon presented in upcoming sessions. I didn't hear any of this from Martha. I only found out when a coworker accidentally showed me an internal email. And it didn't take long to realize Martha had intentionally kept those messages out of the meeting room. That only convinced me Horizon was on the right path. Customers rarely give direct praise, so if they brought up my name on their own, it meant the model had touched something real. But the moment didn't last. Martha reacted immediately. She ordered the entire analysis department to return to the old predictive model for all reports sent to leadership. Nobody understood why she made such a sudden demand, but I did. She didn't want anyone to see the difference between her outdated approach and what I was building. I tried to keep my distance, but some conflicts were unavoidable. In a short meeting, Martha flat out said my methods were too emotional, impossible to measure, and unfit for Northbridge standards. I tried to explain that Horizon had already been validated through real customer patterns, and that the feedback was overwhelmingly positive. But Martha wasn't listening. She only cared about defending the model that had once helped her climb the ladder, and the same one that now kept her from admitting change was necessary. Right when the tension hit its breaking point, Elliot Morgan started appearing in leadership discussions more often. He didn't openly take a side, but he kept asking questions about innovation, new models, and the real value of behavioral data. His questions made Martha stumble, but they only strengthened my resolve. Elliot never interfered directly, but it was clear he was watching Horizon closely. What I didn't realize was that everything was about to reach its tipping point. Horizon was no longer just a research project. It had become the center of a larger clash inside the company, a quiet war between the old vision and the new. And I was standing right in the middle of the storm I helped create. Over the next few weeks, I could feel the tension between Martha and me stretching far beyond the two of us. It seeped through the analysis department and then into other teams. No one said anything out loud, but I knew they were watching, waiting to see what would happen. Everyone at Northbridge understood one thing. Martha never tolerated a challenge to her authority. One Tuesday morning, just as I walked into the office, Martha called me into a small meeting room. On the table was a thick stack of documents and charts painted in painfully familiar colors. They were the old models, the ones the company had relied on for years. Martha pointed at them and said, in that flat voice of hers, that Horizon needed to be standardized according to these models, or it wouldn't be considered for any future presentations. It was her first direct hit, an attempt to strangle Horizon before it could breathe. I tried to stay composed as I explained that Horizon couldn't be forced into those outdated structures. It was built to reflect real behavior, not the theoretical assumptions baked into the current system. But Martha didn't care. She didn't want to understand the difference. All she wanted was compliance, no matter how unreasonable. I walked out of that room heavy with frustration. But what worried me more wasn't her order, it was the look on a few employees' faces when I stepped out. They watched me like they already knew this fight wasn't over, and they were right. That very afternoon, a close colleague told me Martha had been quietly adjusting numbers in the department's reports, not to improve accuracy, but to hide the data showing the old model was failing. If leadership saw those numbers, they'd start asking why Northbridge was still clinging to outdated approaches. And that was the last thing Martha wanted. The news left me angry and strangely sad. Angry because Martha was willing to twist data for her own advantage. Sad because I finally understood how far she would go to protect her title. Horizon didn't just threaten her professional beliefs, it threatened the reputation she'd built over decades. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave, Elliot Morgan appeared, out of nowhere. He gave me a small smile and asked if I had a minute. I nodded, and we stepped into the quiet hallway. Elliot didn't dance around anything. He asked directly what kind of trouble I was having with Martha. I was startled he knew so quickly, but Elliot wasn't the type to speak without reason. I didn't spill everything, but I told him my work wasn't being evaluated fairly and that the resistance was real. Elliot listened carefully, asking about Horizon, about my data gathering process, about how I modeled each behavior segment. Now and then, he'd ask a question so sharp, it sent a chill down my spine, like he could see the pieces I was trying to protect. When I finished, he looked at me for a long moment and said, Horizon might be the key to shifting Northbridge's direction. He added that change always triggers pushback, especially from people with the most to lose. I knew exactly who he meant. Before he left, he said something I haven't forgotten. If you keep going down this path, be ready. Big changes always bring storms. A few days later, the storm began taking shape. Martha called a full department meeting. She announced that the old predictive models were to be reinstated for all reporting. No exceptions, no deviation, no innovation. The only acceptable action was to follow the old protocol. I scanned the room. Most people looked down or away. No one dared object. But in their eyes, I saw exhaustion and disappointment. They knew the old system was falling behind the market, but they also knew no one wanted to be Martha's next target. The tension peaked that same week. A major client sent internal feedback requesting to see my model in their upcoming meeting. But before I could respond, Martha replied on my behalf, telling them Horizon wasn't approved and wouldn't be used. I only found out because a coworker forwarded me the email. I was furious, too furious to work for hours. Not because she rejected the request, but because she did it behind my back, framing me as someone who couldn't deliver. I thought I'd prepared myself for this, but I hadn't. That kind of injustice hits the place you try hardest to ignore, the place where years of effort can be dismissed with a single move. But what I didn't know was that this still wasn't the breaking point. Martha hadn't played her final card, and I could feel myself being pulled deeper into a power struggle no one dared name. Horizon was no longer just a project. It had become the symbol of two opposing mindsets inside the company. I knew things were about to change, and when they did, there would be no going back. That morning started out like any other, but I could feel something waiting to break open. The air in the office felt heavy, as if everyone sensed a shift coming. I arrived earlier than usual, trying to focus on preparing for the biggest client presentation of the quarter. This was the client with the power to lock in a long-term contract, one that could shape Northbridge's revenue for the entire year. They were also the same people who'd mentioned my name in their earlier positive feedback. I'd spent the whole night reworking slides, checking the model, rewriting my script to make every point crystal clear. Even though I knew Martha would never allow Horizon to appear, I still prepared the full presentation. A small part of me hoped that the presence of leadership and the client might force her to reconsider. At the very least, I wanted Horizon to be seen, just once, even if only for a moment. Around 9, I stepped into the large conference room. The space gleamed with bright screens stretching across the wall, a long dark wood table, and polished leather chairs. The clients had nearly all arrived, seated across the table. A few smiled when they saw me enter. They had no idea what was happening inside the company. They only knew I was the person they wanted to hear from. Martha walked in a few minutes later. She wore a charcoal suit, her hair pulled tight, her expression empty. Her eyes flicked over me, quick, sharp, and that was enough to tell me she didn't come here today to let me shine. She came to control the outcome. The presentation began promptly at 9:30. The CEO gave a short introduction, then handed it over to our department. I stood, took a deep breath, and walked to the screen. I opened with a market overview, fresh numbers, shifting patterns, the growing demand for behavioral insights. I could hear the soft tap-tap of a client's pen, a sign they were paying attention. Then I moved to the second section, the part where I intended to introduce Horizon. Before flipping to the next slide, I glanced at Martha. She sat with her arms crossed, waiting. But when the Horizon slide appeared, I continued anyway. I explained how the model blended quantitative data with real-world behavioral drivers. Several clients leaned forward, clearly interested. And that exact moment, Martha stood up. I didn't even finish my sentence before she stepped up to the screen and announced, in her flat, rigid tone, that Horizon was not approved and lacked the basis to be presented. She said it like it was a confirmed policy, even though I knew there had never been any meeting about it. The room fell silent. I straightened, watching her, trying to understand what she was planning. But when she reached for the remote and navigated to the folder containing the Horizon files, I knew this wasn't spontaneous. She knew exactly where the file was, because she had been watching me for months. Martha opened the folder and clicked on a file labeled Horizon Master Version. It was the most important one, the master file containing an entire year of research. When it opened, my charts and models lit up the massive screen. Everything I had built over thousands of hours was right there in front of dozens of people. Martha turned to the clients and said the company had to maintain professional standards and couldn't rely on unverified models. She said it like Horizon was a liability, like my effort was some reckless act of defiance. And then she did something I never imagined a department head could do in front of a client. She moved her finger over the delete button. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, loud as a drum. I stepped forward, but she moved faster. Martha added one more sentence, that the model wasn't aligned with the company direction. And then she pressed the button. The screen flickered once. The file disappeared. No sound effect, no warning. Just a single click, and a year of my work vanished as if it had never existed. The clients stared, some with their mouths open. A silver-haired man turned to the CEO and asked, stunned, if this was standard procedure at Northbridge. The CEO said nothing. His face looked ashen, like he'd just witnessed a collision he couldn't stop. I stood there, hands slack at my sides, feeling like someone had pulled all the air out of the room. I didn't feel anger first. What hit me was loss. So sharp, I had to rest my fingers against the edge of the table to steady myself. I looked at Martha. She wasn't looking at me. She watched the clients instead, wearing that unsettling calm, convinced she had just cemented her power. She believed deleting Horizon proved she was still in control. What she didn't realize was that the moment she hit delete was the moment the cracks in her own career began to show. No one spoke for several seconds. No one knew how to react to something that extreme. Some people looked at me with sympathy. Others stared at Martha, unable to understand why a department head would do that in the middle of a critical presentation. I felt heat rise in my chest. Not anger, but the realization that everything had gone too far. Horizon was gone. I couldn't protect it anymore. She had erased it right in front of me. But what Martha didn't know was that the data wasn't the only thing I had. I straightened, pulled myself together, and walked out of the room without a word. I heard someone call my name behind me, but I didn't turn back. I knew if I stayed even a second longer, I would break. All I could think in that moment was that I had just lost something irreplaceable. I had no idea that only minutes later I would receive a phone call that would change everything. I walked straight out of the conference room because I knew if I stopped for even a second, I wouldn't be able to take another step. The hallway blurred in front of me. I don't remember how long I walked or how I made it down to the lobby. I only remember sinking onto a long bench near the doors, my hands trembling, my mind empty. Sunlight spilled through the glass panels, bright and sharp. Denver's sky was impossibly clear that day. All of it clashed with the fog tightening inside my chest. Horizon was gone. 1 year. 1 year of late nights, long drives, conversations in small shops and crowded offices. All of it now existed only in my memory. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I didn't want to pick up. I didn't want to face anyone. But the screen showed an unfamiliar number from San Francisco. I don't know why, but I answered. The voice on the line was both familiar and distant. Melissa Chen, Chief Strategy Officer at one of our biggest partner firms, and someone who had been in the meeting that morning. Lena, are you all right? Her voice was soft, but the anger underneath it was unmistakable. It took me a moment to say I was fine, even though we both knew I wasn't. I need to speak with you privately about what just happened. Melissa's first sentence carried weight. What your department head did was completely unacceptable, and I want you to know we do not agree with how Northbridge treated you. I didn't speak. I hadn't even decided what I should say. But Melissa didn't wait. We've been following your work on Horizon for months. You didn't know, but we've been evaluating the internal shifts inside Northbridge since your analysis started appearing in their reports. And I can say with absolute certainty, Horizon is exactly what this industry has been waiting for. I sat up straight when I heard the name. Only minutes earlier, Horizon had been wiped out right in front of me. It was hard to believe anyone had truly seen it. Melissa paused for a moment, then spoke slowly, as if she wanted every word to land. We want you to come work with us and lead our new consumer behavior research division. Starting salary will be $300,000 a year, with full creative control over the model you want to build. For a second, I thought I misheard her. I could barely grasp that such an offer was coming now, just minutes after everything at Northbridge had collapsed. I stared out the glass doors. Cars passed. People walked by. Life went on as if nothing had happened. But for me, the world had shifted. I asked Melissa why. Why me? Why now? She didn't hesitate. Because what happened in that meeting showed us two things. First, your company doesn't recognize your value. And second, the work you built isn't inside the deleted folders. It's in the way you think, the way you observe, the way you understand behavior. No one can delete that. I drew a long breath. For the first time since walking out of that room, I felt myself return, felt the weight, the shape of who I was. Not someone whose work had been erased, but someone who had finally been seen. Then my phone chimed again, a new email. I glanced down and saw it was from Martha. The subject line, urgent request to revise all Horizon documentation to fit company protocol. When I opened it, I found a long accusation claiming I had violated procedures, mismanaged data, and acted unprofessionally. I stared at the words for a moment. Martha was trying to rewrite the morning, to turn her sabotage into proof that I had lost control. She wanted to own the narrative. She wanted my story to read like failure, not deliberate destruction. My phone was still pressed to my ear. Melissa asked, Lena, are you still there? My breath was tight, but my voice remained steady. I'm here, Melissa said. You don't have to answer today, but I think you need to leave a place that can't recognize what you bring. And if you say yes, we'll start everything this week. I leaned back against the bench. I knew this decision wasn't just about quitting a job. It would be a declaration that I would never let anyone erase me again. I thanked her and said I'd call back in a few hours. When the call ended, silence returned, only this time it didn't crush me. It felt like space waiting to be filled with something new. I stood and stepped outside. The Denver cold brushed against my face, sharp and invigorating, like I was being reset. A few minutes later, my phone buzzed again. I looked down and froze. It wasn't Melissa. It was someone else. Someone I never expected to call me at a moment like this. One of Northbridge's shareholders. Not Elliot, but someone whose authority sat just below the board. When I answered, a deep male voice went straight to the point. We need to meet as soon as possible. We heard what happened in the presentation, and I think you'll want to know what's about to unfold at Northbridge. A surge of adrenaline ran down my spine. In the span of one morning, I had lost everything and been invited into two new doors at once. I didn't know which door held the better future. I only knew I was about to make the most important decision of my career. I went back to the Northbridge building that afternoon, even though a part of me wanted to go straight home and let everything collapse behind me. But I couldn't walk away in silence. I had let Martha control the narrative for too long. It was time to face it. When the elevator doors opened, I felt the shift immediately. Conversations cut off the moment I walked by. Everyone knew what had happened in the morning meeting. An HR employee found me, saying the CEO had called an emergency meeting and wanted me there immediately. I didn't ask why. I already knew this would be the meeting that decided everything. When I entered the large conference room, nearly all of the upper management was present. Martha stood at the head of the table, hands on a stack of documents, her face wound tight. Elliot sat across from her, calm, but with an edge in his eyes, like he was waiting for the inevitable. The CEO gestured for me to sit. I chose to stand. I didn't want to look like someone being put on trial. I wanted to stand on my own feet. Martha began immediately, her voice flat and rehearsed. She claimed that my presentation of Horizon that morning was insubordinate, a breach of protocol, and a serious misrepresentation to an important client. She emphasized that I had used an unapproved model and bypassed my superiors. I answered evenly, saying the client had requested Horizon multiple times, and that showing it was an attempt to meet their expectations. I added that deleting the model mid-presentation was what truly damaged their trust. Martha cut me off, repeating that Horizon was unauthorized and that I had behaved unprofessionally. The CEO stepped in, asking Martha if the client had indeed requested Horizon. Martha said she had received no valid request. Elliot opened his laptop, typed for a few seconds, then rotated the screen toward the leadership team. On it were three formal client requests, sent through the official system, asking specifically to see Horizon. 3 requests over 6 weeks. The air in the room shifted. Martha's posture stiffened. She hadn't expected Elliot to bring proof. I asked why those requests never made it into the internal reports. The CEO looked at Martha, waiting. Martha claimed the requests hadn't met the reporting criteria. No one believed her. The more she spoke, the shakier her voice became. Elliot said that deleting a model in front of a client was reckless and irresponsible. He spoke slowly, each word like a verdict. Martha snapped back that she was preventing misinformation, that she was protecting the company. I couldn't help myself. I said she deleted Horizon because she was afraid it would prove her old system obsolete, not because she cared about Northbridge. I said her actions hadn't just sabotaged my work, they had damaged the reputation of the entire analysis department. The CEO exhaled heavily, clearly out of ways to shield her. Elliot looked straight at Martha and said the incident had gone far beyond an internal disagreement. It was behavior unbecoming of a department head. I knew this was the moment. I said I would be leaving Northbridge, effective immediately. The room fell silent. Martha whipped her head toward me and said I couldn't resign without giving 2 weeks' notice. I took out my phone and showed an HR email outlining the clause that allowed immediate termination in cases of hostile work environments or managerial sabotage. Martha's eyes widened. Her voice trembled with rage. You'll regret this. No one outside needs your model. No one. I looked at her for a moment before answering. I said no one could erase someone's value with a single click. Horizon might be gone, but what I built, what I learned, couldn't be deleted. And I wouldn't keep working under someone who treated other people's accomplishments as threats. The CEO tried to mediate, offering to move me to another department or grant a temporary leave. I refused. Northbridge was no longer a place where I could grow. I knew that the moment I walked out, I'd find somewhere that saw my worth clearly. I gathered my documents and stepped back. As I walked toward the door, no one said a word, but I could feel their eyes on me. Some looked shocked, some looked relieved. And Elliot, he looked like someone who had known this moment was coming all along. I heard Martha's sharp breathing behind me as the door closed. Maybe she thought I was giving up. Maybe she thought I was running. But she couldn't have been more wrong. I wasn't leaving because I was afraid. I was leaving because I finally understood my value more clearly than ever. I walked out of that conference room with steadier steps than when I entered. I knew my story with Northbridge was over, but I also knew the real storm, the one Martha herself had sparked, was only beginning. When the conference room door closed behind me, I didn't look back. I just wanted to get as far away from that floor as possible, away from the mix of curiosity and tension in everyone's eyes. I grabbed the last few things from my desk, tossed them into a bag, and walked out of the Northbridge building. No farewell speech, no goodbye hug, just the quiet exit of someone who had endured more than enough. I thought things would settle once I left, but 3 days later, I learned it was far from over. A former coworker texted me, only 5 words, but heavy enough to stop me cold. The biggest client is pulling out. I reread the message. I wasn't surprised. What happened in that morning meeting was the first crack. The client didn't just lose trust in the model Martha deleted, they lost trust in the leadership behind it. I hadn't contacted them, but my sudden departure right after the incident must have deepened their doubts. On day 4, 2 more clients announced they were pausing services to reassess the value of the partnership. I knew both of them. One had talked with me for nearly an hour while I was building Horizon. The other once asked me to customize a prediction model for their team. None of them called me, but I knew exactly what their decisions meant. On day 6, another former coworker called during his lunch break. He said the atmosphere inside Northbridge had become chaotic. The once quiet office was now filled with whispers, emergency meetings, and frantic attempts to handle cancellation requests. He told me Martha was in internal meetings almost every day, trying to maintain control, but the more she spoke, the worse things became. I listened, but didn't say much. I didn't want to be dragged back into that spiral. A week after I joined Melissa's company, I got a call from Vernon, the small business owner I'd spent hours interviewing during Horizon's development. He told me straight out that he had canceled his contract with Northbridge. When I asked if he was sure about the decision, he just laughed and said he wanted a consulting team that actually listened. That sentence made something click in me. A name doesn't keep clients. Understanding does. I started settling into my new job, and the way they supported me left me almost overwhelmed. They put together a small team so I could rebuild the prediction model from scratch, with all the creative freedom I had dreamed of. Melissa checked in often, but never interfered. Every time she visited, she only asked what else I needed to do better. It took me a few days to get used to having my ideas valued the moment they left my mouth. While I found my footing, Northbridge kept sinking. Another former coworker called, his voice tight with frustration. Martha, he said, had practically lost control of her team. Half the analysis department had either quit or requested transfers. The ones left were just working to get by, because none of them believed the company could hold on to clients anymore. He said Martha tried rallying each team with the same tired speeches about process and discipline, but no one was buying it. Her answers about the morning incident only made things worse. She tried blaming me, but the people who witnessed her deleting Horizon weren't forgetting anytime soon. I didn't feel satisfied hearing any of this. Just sadness that someone who could have chosen collaboration had chosen control through fear. 2 weeks later, Elliot called. His voice was low, heavier than usual. He said Northbridge was about to lose 3 more major clients. He said leadership was considering removing Martha due to her misconduct and the damage caused by concealing client requests. I listened silently. I felt neither joy nor anger. Everything happening now was simply the natural consequence of sabotage carried out in the open. 5 weeks after I left, something unexpected happened. I received an email from the CEO. His tone was far more respectful than before. He wrote that the company was experiencing unprecedented challenges: sharp revenue decline, eroding client trust, and mass resignations. He admitted he had ignored internal warnings and made critical mistakes. And at the end, he asked a question that made me pause. Would you consider returning to Northbridge to help us rebuild and create a new predictive model? I read it more than once. Part of me felt vindicated. Another part felt tired. Everything I had once hoped they would understand, they were finally seeing. But it had come too late. I was now somewhere where my voice was heard from the first day, not only after everything had collapsed. I drafted a short reply. I thanked him for the offer, but declined. I told him I was building a new path, and I believed it was the right one. That evening, as I stepped out of my new office, I paused in the parking lot, watching the city lights reflecting on the pavement. I realized that even though Northbridge was falling apart, I didn't want that for them. I didn't need them to fail to prove I had been right. I just needed to walk away so I could finally be myself. And when I thought back to the moment Martha pressed delete, I understood something simple. She thought deleting a file meant deleting my value. But in reality, she had deleted the only foundation still holding Northbridge upright. And now they were paying the price for that choice. When I turned down Northbridge's offer to return, I sat in my new office for a long while. Not because I was unsure, my decision was already made, but because I was feeling something I hadn't felt in over a year: freedom. No rigid system hovering over me. No department head is treating me like a threat. Just the space to work the way I knew was right. The next morning, I arrived early. The floor was still quiet. I switched on the lights in our work area and opened my laptop. My new project, a rebuilt, sharper evolution of Horizon, was waiting. But this time, I wasn't building it alone. Melissa had assembled a small team of 3 to support me. They were young, proactive, full of energy, and eager to learn the behavioral modeling methods I'd spent a year developing. They didn't look at me like someone who'd been sabotaged or someone who had failed. They looked at me like someone worth following. We started by reviewing all the data the new company had. I walked them through how to read the subtle shifts in customer behavior, how to categorize audience groups by depth, not just surface numbers. Every time I explained a step, they took notes quickly, asked sharp questions, and immediately started testing new ideas. It made me realize something Northbridge never understood. The right environment unlocks the right potential. Melissa came by mid-morning. She asked if we had hit any roadblocks. I told her everything was going better than expected. She smiled, didn't interrupt, and left a thick stack of reports with future project notes requested by a new client. When she stepped out, one of the team whispered that Melissa expected a lot from me. I didn't reply, but a weight lifted from my chest. For the first time, expectations felt motivating, not suffocating. About a week later, the new model, temporarily named Insight Path, started taking shape. It was faster than Horizon, more flexible, and better matched to real-world data, partly because I had learned from Horizon's limitations, partly because I finally had the right team behind me. Internal discussions became lively debates about how to refine the model. No one tried to force me into a template. No one asked me to format notes in the standard layout. Every idea was tested before being judged. While I poured myself into Insight Path, Northbridge kept sinking. Industry forums started buzzing with updates about them. People sent me posts claiming the company was preparing for more layoffs. Then came rumors about a potential acquisition by a larger firm. Former colleagues texted, asking if I could help them get into my new company. I wanted to help, but Melissa's team was still too small. All I could do was promise to keep their names in mind when positions opened. One afternoon, Melissa called me into a small meeting room. She handed me a thick printed packet, pages of feedback from test clients using Insight Path. I read through it slowly. They said the model predicted more accurately, reflected real behavior better, and, my favorite line, had a human quality in the way it analyzed patterns. I laughed at that one. Everything Martha once dismissed as unprofessional had become my greatest strength. Melissa said the clients wanted to sign a formal contract to integrate Insight Path into their systems. They were even proposing a long-term partnership if the model kept evolving. She looked at me and said, "You've changed the direction of this entire division in just a few weeks." I couldn't answer. I only nodded. I didn't need praise. I just needed to know my work wasn't treated like disposable waste. In the weeks that followed, I joined more major client meetings. Every time I presented Insight Path, they leaned in, listening closely. They asked deeper questions, wanted to see how my team gathered data. No one doubted me. No one looked at me with the dismissive skepticism I had lived with at Northbridge. I felt like I was finally walking the path I'd been trying to carve for the last year. Only now, nothing stood in my way. One late evening, as I packed up to go home, a former coworker texted me. He said Martha had been suspended pending a disciplinary hearing. I stood still for a moment. Not happy, not sad, just aware that the final loop had closed. I looked out the window. Denver was washed in nighttime light. A rare, quiet peace settled over me. Not because Martha had been suspended, not because Northbridge was collapsing, but because I had finally escaped a place that was never meant for me. I turned off the office lights, stepped into the hallway, and knew that Insight Path was only the beginning. I had a team, I had trust, and more importantly, I had myself back. No one could ever erase what I built. No one could define my worth for me. From that moment on, I knew my real journey was just beginning. And this time I was completely free to write the next chapter. Insight Path grew faster than anything I ever imagined. In just 6 weeks, 3 major companies had already signed on for pilot deployments. Melissa kept coming in with new rounds of positive feedback. My team was so busy some nights we stayed until long after sunset, but no one complained. The whole floor buzzed with the kind of energy I hadn't felt in years, nothing like the pressure and quiet dread that used to swallow me at Northbridge. I started receiving invitations to speak at industry conferences. Market analysis articles mentioned my name when discussing personalized behavioral prediction models. I never expected my work to gain attention this quickly. A part of me still couldn't believe the good things happening were actually mine. Then, one Thursday morning, while I was preparing materials for a weekend conference, Melissa knocked and stepped inside. She held a folder in her hand. The way she looked at me told me something serious had happened. I thought you should see this from me before you see it anywhere else. I opened the folder. On the first page was the official merger announcement. Northbridge was being absorbed by a large conglomerate. A small line underneath explained the reason: failure to maintain core revenue. I turned the page and found a list of personnel being cut. Martha's name was on it. I sat still for several seconds. Not because I needed to know what happened to her, but because it felt like everything had fallen into place exactly the way it needed to. The chapter I fought so hard to escape had closed on its own. I wasn't happy, and I wasn't hurt. I just felt a clear, quiet peace, like I had finally shut the last door behind me. Melissa said Northbridge was in transition, and several of their clients had already reached out to us. They wanted a new consulting team, something more reliable, something they could trust. She added that many of the clients I used to work with mentioned me specifically as the reason they wanted to reconnect. So I didn't speak. I wasn't sure how to respond. Everything was happening too fast. I had spent a year being doubted, dismissed, and erased, and now the very people who refused to listen were seeking out the work they once ignored. That afternoon, I received another email, this time from Northbridge's former CEO. He apologized for what had happened to me. He admitted he hadn't listened soon enough. He said Martha had been terminated after an internal investigation revealed she had concealed information and manipulated data in multiple reports. He ended by saying he hoped I had found a better place. I read the email a few times, then deleted it. Not because I was angry, but because I no longer needed to keep anything tied to that place. I had no room left for remnants of the past. The next morning, I arrived at the office early, as usual. The morning light fell across the empty desks in soft rectangles. I opened my laptop and went back to refining the last phase of Insight Path before the big presentation next week. My team walked in a few minutes later, carrying coffee, pastries, and laughter. One of them sat beside me and said, full of excitement, Insight Path is going to change how this entire industry works. I know it. I didn't answer at first. I looked at them. The people who believed in me before I'd proven anything. The people who wanted to learn instead of compete. Then I nodded. We're going to make it the best tool it can be. That afternoon, I prepared for a meeting with a major client who had just expanded their contract. They wanted to roll out Insight Path across their branch network in the Pacific Northwest. When I presented, they listened closely to every word. No interruptions, no sighs, no skeptical glances. When I finished, they stood, shook my hand, and called me a leader of a new era. After they left, I stood looking at Insight Path on the screen and thought about the nights I stayed awake at Northbridge, the times Martha dismissed my ideas, the moment Horizon vanished from that conference room display. If I had broken down that day, none of this would exist. Insight Path wouldn't exist. And the version of me standing here wouldn't exist either. I left work later than usual. On my way home, I stopped at a small bridge near the office. The wind skimmed the surface of the water, making soft ripples. I stood there for a long moment, letting myself feel the quiet relief I rarely allowed. I didn't need Northbridge to crash. I didn't need Martha to fall. I didn't need the past to fix itself for me. I just needed one place that let me prove what I could do, and I had found it. I turned away from the bridge and walked into the cold Denver air, knowing this wasn't the end of anything. It was the end of a chapter. For the first time in a long year, my future wasn't in anyone else's hands but my own, and that was the greatest victory I had ever claimed.